Welcome everybody to part 4 of module 9, which is social psychology. Today what we're going to be talking about is prejudice and discrimination. So again, we're going to be kind of defining a lot of these different pieces here. So the first one we're going to talk about is prejudice. Another way to think of this, prejudgment, right? You can kind of see how those two words are connected. So what is prejudice? And again, I'm just going to give you the specific definition right off the page here. It's an unjustifiable, usually negative attitude towards a group of people based on their membership in a group. Now, again, this is really important, is that what makes something prejudiced is that we are connecting somebody to or having an attitude towards someone based on their group membership, okay? Obviously, when individuals actually exhibit certain traits, we're going to connect them to those traits, right? That makes sense. So when it's prejudice is when we are, connecting them or having a specific attitude towards them based on the membership itself. Now, notice it says this is usually negative, but it's not always negative, right? Generally, when people talk about prejudice, though, they're referring to kind of more negative prejudices. But we can kind of have it both ways. So, I think a simple example of one could be could kind of gets in. We're getting a little bit ahead because we're going to talk about stereotypes in just a second. But you could be have a prejudice, right? An unjustifiable attitude towards, let's say, Asian Americans, right? Believing that with the idea that all Asians are good at math, right? That's a stereotype. Again, we'll get there in just a moment. But that might change the attitude you have toward them, right? And again, now the important thing is we are assuming that someone has a certain behavior or have certain characteristics just based on their group membership, right? Where we're looking at someone and we say, oh, they're Asian, they must be good at math because they are Asian, right? Again, we're kind of stepping a little bit ahead into kind of the stereotype side of things. But again, what's happening then is that affects our attitude towards them, right? Again, usually feelings of prejudice involve stereotypes. We'll talk about in just a moment. So we have some kind of stereotype. That stereotype then allows us or kind of pushes us to have a certain attitude, a certain feeling towards that group, right? Or people in that group. And then that can affect kind of the next step, which is changes our behavior, right? Again, we already talked earlier about how attitudes affect behaviors, right? And behaviors affect attitudes. We can kind of see some of the same things here, but now we're just focusing it in a little bit more. And again, that when we get to kind of the action side or actual behaviors, now we're getting into discrimination. So I want to draw that kind of line here in just a moment. Again, I want to highlight one of the really, really important parts of prejudice, and this is what separates it from discrimination specifically, is prejudice is an attitude. It is a feeling, right, about this group, okay? So the next thing we're going to talk about is stereotypes and discrimination. Now, again, this is going to kind of all connect back into all these pieces, right? So stereotype is a generalized belief about a group of people. Now, the thing about stereotypes is there can be some level of accuracy in them, right? So a lot of times stereotypes will come from something where, okay, there's some grain of accuracy in there, but then we take that and we tend to overgeneralize that, right? So a simple example we can already use is the stereotype I gave as the earlier example, right? If the belief that all Asians are good at math. Now, some Asians are very good at math, right? But where it becomes a stereotype is where I say, okay, some people I've met are good at math, and I attribute that to all of them, right? And now I say, oh, this is just something about this group. Everybody in this group has this characteristic, okay? Now, this is something that we're not really going to mention much here, but one thing that's really important to actually about stereotypes is they're very hard to get rid of. And the reason for that is that even though we know that they're not necessarily accurate, it doesn't necessarily get rid of them. So for example, the one I've been using, which is kind of more of a lighter one, the idea that all Asians are good at math. If I asked you, is every single Asian actually good at math? Pretty much everybody would be like, well, no, obviously not, right? But it still tends to be a stereotype that we have, right? It still tends to be a thing where when people meet someone who's Asian who's not good at math, they're like surprised and they're like, "Oh, I thought this was a thing," right? So these are still they hold pretty tight onto us. Now, obviously, stereotypes can be much more damaging than the one that I'm using, even though the one I'm using can also be damaging as well. But just kind of as an example. The next piece here is discrimination. So discrimination is unjustifiable negative behavior towards a group and its members. So one thing that's important here is all of these pieces are kind of connecting. Oops, I wanted to move the slides. All of these pieces are kind of connecting between prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination. So generally, the way it kind of works is there is a stereotype about a group, right? So let's use maybe one that's a little more, I don't know if I want to use the word extreme, but like a little more damaging, right? So a stereotype that's been not uncommon, pretty common in the U.S. for a lot of its history is the idea that black men are aggressive. Okay, that is a stereotype. Now, again, some of everybody, right? Some people are aggressive, but that doesn't mean all of them are, right? So that's a stereotype we can have. Now, if I have that stereotype, if I have that generalized belief about this group of people, that's going to possibly lead me to be prejudiced towards them, right? If I believe that stereotype, right, and obviously the more I believe it, or the less I believe it is going to be really important. But if I believe that stereotype, that's going to change my attitude towards that group of people, right? If I believe that a group of people is aggressive, that's going to change my attitude towards them, right? That's going to change the way I feel about them, right? I might be afraid of them. I might be think negatively of them. I might feel aggressive towards them, right? There's all these different kind of things I can have going on. So that's can cause prejudice. Now, prejudice, obviously, as we know, attitudes affect our behaviors. Prejudice then can lead back to discrimination and now affect these behaviors that we have, right? So we started with a stereotype that led me to feel a certain way. When I feel a way about a group of people, that might lead me to act negatively toward them, right? So maybe I'm going to be more aggressive towards African American men, right? Because, again, starting back at the beginning, I have this generalized stereotype that they are more aggressive. So you can kind of see how these pieces stack up and kind of are all connected here. And again, it's all really something we've already talked about, right? It was all the things we talked about before about attitudes and how they affect what we do. That's going to get us to our next piece, which is in-groups and out-groups. And again, this is all connected to what we've already talked about. So in-group is, you can think of it as the us. In-group is people with whom we share a common identity. Pretty straightforward. Now, what this identity is obviously varies a ton, and it doesn't have to be the exact same identity, right? So like you can share a common identity with people culturally, ethnically, geographically, right? You can look at a school, right? If you go to DO, you share a common identity that is partly your in-group, right? You share a common identity with these people, okay? It is the us. We also have what's called the out group, which is pretty straightforward, is the other side. So if there's an us, that means the other side is them, right? So our out group is those we perceive as different, right? Or separate from our in group, okay? Again, we can think about this there's a million different ways, right? You can have in group, out group based on gender. You can have in group, out group based on the school you go to, the sporting team that you support, the group that you're a part of. Racially or ethnically, you can have different in-groups and out-groups, right? But we see this kind of separation, right? Now, again, these are kind of, as you can see on the screen, right? Roots of prejudice, kind of these building blocks that we have. And this us-them thing is a natural kind of piece that we have as human beings. We naturally, and we'll get in this a little bit later in this video here, we naturally kind of label groups, right? We like to see patterns. We like to see groups. So we naturally label the us and we naturally label the them. Now, what's really important about this is the last piece here, which is in-group bias. So this is the basic idea that we have a tendency to favor our own group, right? So, and I'll use, I think, maybe the sporting team example, right? where you'll have people, let's say we're looking at football teams, right? So you'll have people that are maybe supporters of, let's use the Raiders because they're in Las Vegas now, right? So that are supporters of the Raiders. And then you'll have people who are supporters of, let's use the Broncos because that's, I'm from Colorado. So the Broncos is the team that I would watch if I was in Colorado, right? So you've got supporters of those two different teams. Now, again, right, we can draw in-group, out-groups. So if I'm a Bronco fan, the other people I see in Bronco gear, that is my in-group, right? That is the people that I have a common identity with. All the people in the black and the silver, those are the Raider fans, right? That's my out-group. Now, the important piece is also this bias that I'm going to have. So when I tend to look at those groups, I'm going to tend to favor mine. I'm going to tend to look more kindly upon the people that are part of my group and less kindly upon the people that are part of the other group. And really simple ways that we can see this is when we see people literally get in real fights over sporting events, right? Where they'll fight each other or get in arguments with each other about the different groups that they're a part of, right? Even though obviously as fans, none of us are actually a part of these teams, right? But we still see these kind of separations in groups. We tend to have a tendency to like our own and dislike the other. You can see the same thing. I've used the politics example before, but it's really easy. You can see the same thing with how different political parties look at each other, right? The Democrats talk and look at Republicans very differently than they do Democrats and vice versa, right? So you can see that bias that we have towards our own group. That's going to get us to what is called the scapegoat theory. So the scapegoat theory is a theory of prejudice, okay? And so it's a theory of prejudice. What it does is the idea is that prejudice offers this outlet for anger by providing a scapegoat, right? By providing someone to blame. So it's pretty straightforward, right? When there is something wrong or something that is makes us angry, we look for something and someone specifically in this, right? Someone to blame. And when we can do that, we can aim prejudice at them to try and, kind of relieve, we could say like the anger or the stress that we're feeling, right? The arousal that we're feeling. We can see this through a whole bunch of different examples. So I gave you some at the bottom there, right? So for example, economically frustrated people tend to express heightened prejudice. So people that are, economically frustrated, whether they're poor or they're struggling to kind of move up in the world, right, tend to be more prejudiced than people who aren't. We also see that when people are frustrated, even if it's temporarily, it makes them more prejudiced. So if you have someone who already has a little bit of prejudice and then maybe they're having a really bad day, they'll actually be more prejudiced than they would normally, right? So again, the idea is that we can kind of look for a scapegoat, someone to blame. A really big historical example of this we could be Nazi Germany, right? To kind of give a little context, right? Germany after World War I was really, really struggling economically because of a whole bunch of, penalties and sanctions and things that were on them at the time. So it wasn't going well. Living in Germany was not good at the time, right? So one of the things the Nazi Party did was it found a scapegoat, right? So what it did, and part of what it did, right, was it blamed the Jewish people for those economic frustrations, right? And it allowed people to aim that prejudice at them, right? It allowed them to use that prejudice as an outlet for that anger, right? So you can kind of think about how this can be used here. So now what we're going to talk about for these next few pieces is these cognitive roots of prejudice, okay? So how prejudice is connected to the literal way that we think as human beings. Okay, so one big thing is, and I think this is really important actually, is that these kind of ideas of stereotypes and even prejudice to some extent are things that are almost like, I don't know how I want to say this. I don't want to say they're naturally hardwired, but are kind of natural outgrowths in some ways of how our brains work. So one of the ways that our brains function, or one of its jobs, right, is to simplify the world. And one of the ways it does that is it categorizes, right? This is why we have a million categories for things, right? We have categories of animals, of cats versus dogs versus apes versus birds, right? Versus fish, right? You can think of all these different categories we have. We have different categories for objects like furniture and chairs, computers, cars, phones, all these different things. We have different categories for people, right? We naturally want to categorize the world. We want to make groups, okay? Now, obviously, when we categorize, what that forces us to do is that we must stereotype them, right? When I look at a group of people, right, to categorize them, I must stereotype them. I must assume, right, certain generalizations about a whole group to kind of put them all together. So you can kind of see how this kind of more abstract idea of needing to categorize and our brain naturally wanting to categorize things then leads to, at least some extent, something like stereotypes. Okay? Now we can see this through a few different ways. So one example is what is called the other race effect. So the other race effect is actually something that happens very, very early in life. It happens in our infancy. And what it is our tendency to recall faces of our own race more accurately than other races. Okay? So when I look at people that are my own race, I am better at recalling and accurately remembering what those faces are and who they are and what they look like than if they are part of another race. Now, again, this is something we see across the board. Now, obviously, as infants, this would be a little different, but as we get older, right, you can make arguments about how society affects that, right? So obviously, if you are, let's say, a Black American, and you live in a community where pretty much everybody else is white, we might see some changes in how much this affects us, right? But even as infants, right, when we're around people, we see this kind of tendency. Okay. Really simple example of this, and we'll watch kind of like a little bit more funny clip of this happening, is this idea where people think that everybody from one race look the same, where they can't remember who different people are, right? So the idea that like sometimes like white people will think that all Black people look the same, or Black people think all white people look the same, right? That's actually something that's coming out of this idea that we actually kind of lose this ability, or we kind of have this tendency to struggle to differentiate and accurately recall these differences in these faces of other races specifically. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Sorry, I tried to take us to the link to the video I'm going to show you guys later. Hold on 1 second. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. So the next piece we want to talk about is what we would call vivid cases. Now, vivid cases is something that we've actually already talked about, which is the availability heuristic. But the general concept, as we're going to refer to it here, is the idea that vivid cases are more readily available, right, in our memory, thus availability heuristic, and therefore influence our judgments of a group. So when I try to think of a group of people, for example, the most vivid cases are likely going to be the ones that are going to have the biggest impact on what I think about that group. So if I have a really negative experience, or I've had if I've literally had negative experiences with certain groups, right? Those 1 or 2 or 3 really negative experiences, because they're very vivid, might outweigh a lot of 100 positive experiences, right? And again, this just gets back to the availability heuristic that we already talked about, right? The more available a memory it is, the more influential it is on our judgments. A simple example of this we can see in the U.S. with terrorism, right? Generally, if you went around and you asked everybody in the U.S., what does a terrorist look like, right? It wouldn't be uncommon for them to describe somebody who is Muslim, right? But the reality is obviously the vast majority of Islamic people are not terrorists, right? And they're not even the biggest part of terrorists, or not even most terrorists are Islamic, right? So, but what happens is it is the most vivid for us, right? In the U.S., the most vivid examples of terrorism that we think about for most of us tend to be Muslims, right? Especially And this was obviously, even more impactful. We'll see it maybe change a little bit over time, but people who were alive during 9/11, it's, even more so because that example, that case is so vivid that when you think about something like this, it immediately connects it, right? It's super available. If you ask someone who was alive at that time and living in the US, about terrorism, that's almost always going to be the first example that comes to their head. And because that's the first example, it then is going to influence their judgment of that group. Right now, obviously, as time goes on, right, a lot of kids, now that are younger weren't alive during that. So maybe they won't have that same vivid case, and they'll have a little bit different ideas, right? But these vivid cases and this availability heuristic cause these kind of snap judgments, which cause us to then, again, think about these groups differently, judge these groups differently. You can obviously see how these pieces, right, lead to stereotypes, lead to prejudice, can then lead to discrimination. We also can see things like victim blaming be used to justify prejudices. Victim blaming is pretty simple concept. Basically, the idea that we look at something that happens and then we blame the victim. I think the most commonly used one is where happens to be with like sexual assault or rape against women, right? Where maybe if a girl is out and she's dressed maybe more scandalously, right? And then something happens to her, people go, well, she just shouldn't have been dressed like that, right? And again, what it allows us to do is kind of justify this prejudice that we have by blaming them for, their own victimhood, basically. And again, too, we can obviously amplify this through hindsight bias. This idea, right, that we look back and kind of, think that we always believed this way, right? Think that, okay, I've always thought that. Or we can look back and kind of change what we're thinking about a little bit. So that's actually going to wrap up this section, pretty short. Take a few moments, do a quick summary here, and I will see you guys next time.